Uh, so glad you're here. My name is Shannon Sarna. I'm editor at large for The Nosher, and I'm very excited and honored to be joined by my colleague, my friend Leah Koenig tonight. Her newest cookbook was just came out. Look at this gorgeous book called Portico. Um, and we're going to be talking about Roman Jewish food, Roman Jewish breakfast traditions. We're going to leave lots of time for questions at the end. If you don't know Leah and Leah's writings, where have you been? Please go buy all of her cookbooks. This is your seventh cookbook, right, Leah?
Right.
I'm going to read a little bit about her just because she's so impressive, and I want you all to know her if you don't already. Her writing and recipes have appeared in everywhere: the New York Times, New York Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Food and Wine, Taste, Food 52, The Nosher, and many, many other places. Her newsletter, The Jewish Table, which you should definitely subscribe to. The recipes always look amazing. Reaches thousands of subscribers each week. In addition to writing, Leah leads cooking demonstrations and workshops around the country. She lives in Brooklyn, New York, with her husband and her two adorable children. I just think she's the cat's pajamas. So I'm so happy that we get to have this conversation tonight. So Leah, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us, and congratulations on your beautiful new book.
Oh, thank you. Gosh, I am blushing a little bit. It's wonderful to be here with you as always, and I feel the same about you. So thanks for having me.
I'm also, before we get too far into this conversation, I'm also going to drop the link to her book, Portico, in the chat. I'll share it at the end, and it'll also go out in the follow people. So if you need some early holiday gift shopping, this book is so beautiful. It's beautiful just to look at, but it's so interesting, and you guys will get a taste of that tonight as well. So I thought we could start a little bit with the history of Jews in Rome, because I will admit that there was so much that I learned just by reading the intro of this book that I thought I knew a lot about Italian Jewish history and a bit about Roman Jewish history, but I really didn't. So talk a little bit about like the history, the three waves and types of Jews who make up the Roman Jewish community, because I imagine other people are not as familiar with this as well.
Totally. Yeah. So I've been writing about Jewish food for 15 plus years at this point, and I've really made it, part of my life's work to kind of explore different corners of the global Jewish world and the foods that they eat. And it has made my life and my work very rich, because there's so many wonderful communities out there that make up the mosaic that is Jewish cuisine. But bar none, my favorite of all of those communities, maybe aside from my own Ashkenazi background, is Rome, the Jews of Rome. It is I think a lot of people who have been to Rome, if they are Jewish, they probably have sought out the Jewish quarter. So maybe they have like a little bit of an idea, or like they've eaten a fried artichoke, which is their most popular dish, or the one that people know about the most. But the history is so vast, and it dates back 2,000 uninterrupted years. I like to say, the first Jews who came to Rome actually were emissaries of Judah the Maccabee, right? So if you're familiar with the Hanukkah story, you kind of have a sense of that timing. There were Jews who were fleeing ancient Greece and didn't feel safe. Fleeing ancient Judea, which was under the control of the ancient Greeks, and came to Rome because at that time the Roman emperors were at least indifferent, if not tolerant of Jews, and said, okay, do whatever you want, practice what you want. We have our empire to worry about. You're small, whatever. So there are some Jews who can date or kind of trace their lineage, or they say they can, back to Roman times, which I'm not 100% sure. I haven't seen the receipts of that, but I think it's great that there are people who identify with, being ancient Romans. So that group is called Italkim, like folks of Italy, basically. And then there's a second group in this community that came during the Spanish Inquisition. And so these are Jews who came from Spain and Portugal and Sicily, which at the time was ruled by Spain. because Italy wasn't a unified country that it is today. It was a bunch of little nation states. And so Sicily, all the rules of the Spanish Inquisition, which basically said Jews had to convert to Catholicism, flee, or be murdered. So not great options. But so all those rules applied to Spain, Portugal, and the south of Italy, especially Sicily, where there was a very large, relatively speaking, Jewish community. So in the 15th, 16th century, you have this wave come and introduce things like using raisins and pine nuts and making baked goods with almonds and all sorts of things that are now just part of the Roman Jewish culinary lexicon. And then more recently, in the 1960s, after the Six-Day War in Israel, when Jews were fleeing Arabic-speaking countries, Morocco, Libya, a lot of places in North Africa, something like 4,000 or 5,000 Jews from Libya moved to Rome because Libya had been an Italian colony. So a lot of Libyan Jews spoke some Italian, if they weren't fluent, they at least spoke some or understood some. So it was an easy place for them to come. So now, in the year 2023, we have these kind of three communities all mixed together and about 16 or 17,000 people. It's not a large community. And I can talk more about, the history of like why the community developed if you think that there's interest in that. But those are kind of the three groups that we're talking about.
It's so interesting because I feel like you hear about the Jews as being like, Sephardi, but I didn't know those three sort of iterations. I know that for you, Roman Jewish food is very personal in some ways. So maybe you could talk a little bit about when you were first introduced to it. I know you shared a little snippet of it, but you talk a lot about it in the intro of your book. I feel like it's really quite lovely.
Thanks. Yeah, actually, before I get to that, I do want to just mention kind of the most important defining moment of Roman Jewish history, which was the 315 years that Roman Jews were forced by papal decree to live in the Roman Jewish ghetto. The word ghetto is actually originally an Italian word, so it comes from Italy. The first Jewish ghetto was in Venice, and the second one was in Rome. And it started in the 1540s, right after all of those Sephardi Jews moved from the Inquisition. And all of a sudden, the Pope, I think, was like, like they're getting a little out of hand. They're getting a little too powerful. Let's find ways to curtail their power. And so they forced all the Jews to live in this very small, like 4-block by 4-block, essentially a slum. I mean, imagine like dark, cramped streets, no sunlight, didn't smell good. The Tiber River flooded, twice a year, if not more, just not a good place to live. And Jews were not allowed to do a lot of professions. Interestingly, they were allowed to sell fried food. So it'd be frigatory. So that's why fried food, one of the reasons why fried food is a big part of Roman Jewish cuisine. They were not allowed to buy large fish. They could only buy small fish, which is why you see a lot of anchovies and things like that in their cuisine. But, jokes on the oppressors, because those have a lot of omega-3s and kept that very impoverished community healthy during that time. But so out of that, I would say for me, unimaginable strife and hardship came this really tight-knit, just super bonded community and a cuisine that is unlike any other Jewish cuisine in the world, right? I mean, that's true. Like Moroccan Jewish cuisine is very different than Lithuanian Jewish cuisine, which is very different than Indian Jewish cuisine. But there's something very special about Rome because of that, the impacts of the ghetto. So in terms of my own, relationship, I grew up Ashkenazi. I'm Lithuanian and Russian on one side and German on the other, and didn't really have a huge concept as when I was growing up about food that wasn't Ashkenazi. I mean, a little bit of Sephardi, Moroccan carrot salad that would show up at my synagogue's Friday night dinner, or some hummus or falafel that kind of became imported from Israel and the Middle East in the 1980s and 90s when I was becoming aware of those things. But I really did not know in any way, shape, or form how expansive Jewish community was. And when I got married back in 2008, 2009, my husband and I went on our honeymoon to Rome. And, at that point, I was starting to write. I was starting to write about Jewish food, and I had kind of exhausted the early matzo ball stories that I was going to write, and was kind of seeking out something that was beyond that. So I contacted people on our trip, and we met this wonderful woman, Michaela Pavoncello, who was a tour guide there, and she gave an amazing tour that just blew my mind about the history. She still gives tours today, so if you're in Rome, I'd be happy to share that information. And we went to a Shabbat dinner at a Roman kosher caterer's house named Giovanni, and everything on the table was unfamiliar to me, right? It was the stracotto di manzo, which is a beef stew with wine and red, and passata, tomato passata, and chicken and veal meatball stew with celery and tomato, and all sorts of just delicious things that were 100% not what I ate growing up. And yet it felt so familiar, because we were sitting at his Shabbat table and making the blessings and talking like old friends within a matter of minutes. And in some real way, it actually crystallized my desire to make Jewish food my life, and to say, yes, I can do this as a career, because there's so much to explore. I have this picture. I don't know if you guys can see. Oh, the ring light is making it. So that's me at 26, and my husband also at 26, Yoshi. We were in Rome at a Jewish food festival that same caterer had put on that weekend, and we're drinking mint tea, which is part of the Libyan Jewish community's impact. It has peanuts in it, which sounds weird, but it's so delicious. There's a recipe for it in the book, and you get a little snack with your tea. So I keep this photo on our nightstand. I actually wasn't planning to share it. And then when I was setting up in our room, I was like, oh, I should share this. Because it really, you can't tell, but if you look closely, you can see my little 20-something-year-old brain just exploding with excitement and passion. And so this book was really my chance to give something back to the community that in many ways, shaped my life personally and professionally.
I mean, I just think that story is so beautiful, and it's so interesting to hear how this, the inspiration sort of came about in this way for, such a meaningful career that you've had. So a few times I've seen you write sort of the phrase uniquely Roman Jewish food, right? So maybe you could talk a little bit about what is that? What is Roman Jewish food?
Sure. I also noticed in the chat that someone asked if there's a Roman Jewish dialect, and there is. It's called Judaico-Romanesco, Jewish Roman. So it's very similar to Yiddish or Ladino or any other kind of Hebrew/local language hybrid. And the elders in the community still speak it. I don't know if there's any sort of revival amongst the younger people, but when you go to the Jewish ghetto neighborhood today, which doesn't look all that much like what it used to, because it's been updated and it doesn't flood anymore, and all of these improvements have been made, but the elders still go and they still sit kind of like an open air JCC, and they chat and they gossip and they argue about how to trim artichokes. I literally saw a fight almost break out about how you trim an artichoke. It was wild. And they speak Judaico-Romanesco to each other. So just an aside. So Roman Jewish food, I think, can be categorized in a few ways. One is it's very vegetable forward. It was very much a poverty cuisine, right? I mean, the Jews of Rome were very poor. I mean, cucina povera, like poverty cuisine, is something that exists in lots of different places, including other parts of Jewish cuisine. But I would say it was to an extreme in Rome, where they were literally, making, grinding like bones from the chicken to stretch their meatballs. They don't do that anymore, but there's that chicken and veal meatball dish that I mentioned, and its colloquial name actually has to do with the Hebrew word for bones, because they've ground up bones in it. And gross, don't do that. But that's it was very much a poverty cuisine. So they were the upside to that is they were finding ways to take very simple ingredients and make them sing, right? And the one kind of, I would say, like little boon to their experience was that they were living in the cradle of olive oil, or one of the cradles of olive oil. And so they had abundant olive oil to use. So a lot of their dishes are kind of heart and soul based on olive oil, whether it's a soup that has like a little glistening golden top sheen because of the olive oil, or all these dishes that are, that are fried, shallow fried or deep fried. That's another thing. You also see a lot of baked goods that are made with ground almonds, which is from the Sephardi influence on the cuisine. Amaretti, like the little cookies, and pizza ibraica, which are actually these like delicious bar cookies stuffed with almonds and raisins and pine nuts and, candied fruits. Here, I'll show you. That's what they look like. When you make them, which you should, they're so good, and you serve them, people are going to be clamoring for that recipe because they are so unique and so delicious. They do a lot with like long, slow braises, which is another thing that does feel somewhat similar to other parts of Jewish cuisine. They stracotto di manzo is their kind of most famous beef stew, and you cook it for hours and hours, and it has a lot of sauce, and then you end up serving it in two courses. You serve the sauce with rigatoni, although there's some households that are one side Roman and one side Libyan Roman, and so they serve the stracotto with couscous instead of rigatoni, which I love. And then you serve the second part, just the meat, as like like your brisket equivalent. So yeah, lots of vegetables, lots of delicious fried things, a lot of not too sweet sweets. It's a very like simple but flavorful cuisine.
We shared one of the recipes from this book, that beautiful rosemary garlic chicken on the site. And I'll say, just personally, I tasted the chicken. Leah made it for me, and we filmed something we're going to share soon about it. But one of several people commented, like, sort of surprised about the simplicity of that. And I think like that's something that's very striking about the food, is that, I think we overcomplicate things in some way. And you talk a lot about the simplicity of ingredients.
Yeah, there are actually a lot of recipes where when I got the recipe from, a Jewish grandmother in Rome, or from someone who, whose family had a cookbook, like a family cookbook, I looked at the recipes and I said, that's not going to taste like very much, right? Because it was so simple. But then I made them, and there are times in the book where I take the liberty of adding more garlic or slightly different herbs or a little lemon zest, or just to kind of make things taste a little more complex, but not very often. But what I was really surprised by is how much flavor you can coax out of these very simple recipes, including that chicken dish, which is literally just chicken, potatoes, garlic, rosemary, and that's pretty much it. Salt, pepper, olive oil. And it sounds like, oh, that's boring. But when you taste it, there's something about the alchemy of the rosemary and the garlic and the chicken that just makes it taste different than what you're familiar with.
So obviously Yom Kippur is literally like a few days away. So tell us, like, what are Yom Kippur breakfast traditions? I assume it's not bagel and lox or blint souffle. So what Jewish breakfast recipes look like?
Totally. Yes, there's nary a bagel in sight. It's actually funny, when I was in Rome on that same honeymoon trip, we were going to that Shabbat dinner. I remember going to a bakery and saying to my husband Yoshi, like, oh, we should grab some challah to bring with us, and going into the Roman Jewish bakery and then being like, there's challah. And then it dawning on me, and me feeling very naive, that of course there's no challah. That's not a Roman Jewish thing. That's an Austrian and German and Eastern European Jewish thing. So silly me. But yes, there's 4 dishes I want to describe about that Roman Jews love. There's a few more in the book, but I don't want to bore anybody. And these ones stand apart. So as you know, for Yom Kippur is a holiday where we don't eat for 25 hours, and yet there are two big meals associated with the holiday, right? So there's the meal you eat right prior to the fast starting, and then there's the meal that you eat to break the fast. And so the Libyan Roman Jews have this wonderful dish called tebeha con cechi, or it's basically like a braised chicken and chickpea stew. It's very delicious. They have a lot of very flavorful meat and vegetarian stews in the Libyan side of the cuisine. And cechi are chickpeas. And so there's this amazing tradition that some families follow of smashing some of the chickpeas in the dish as it's cooking, as a way of like representing how during the Day of Atonement, human beings, like we're this imperfect vessel awaiting God's judgment, and we're striving to mend like the broken places in our lives. And so the chickpeas literally become edible symbols of that brokenness. And I just love that. Jews love an edible symbol. It's like what we're best at. So that is when. And then when it comes to breaking the fast, the most just stunningly amazing thing that I remember someone telling me, I was interviewing a woman named Gila Ottolenghi Sanders. And she's a Roman Jew. She grew up there and she now lives in Atlanta. I think her husband is American. She's lived there for a while, but she remembers all the foods, and she still makes a lot of the foods that she grew up eating. And she told me that a lot of Roman Jews break their fast with brodo, like broth. So they make like a chicken broth that's actually also enriched with beef. So it's very nourishing. It's very rich. It's very, it's not heavy. It's delicate tasting, but it's like filled with nutrients. And she said that what they do is they literally break the fast by drinking a cup of brodo, like just, sipping it plain. And then they have more with a meal with stuffed pasta in it. So it's kind of like a kreplach equivalent, but it's their version, or like a tortellini. Recipes in the book for all of these dishes. And I just thought that was so brilliant, right? Like, I love a cheesy kugel. Like, I love it so much. But there's something so wonderful about the idea of after 25 hours of not eating, entering the world of consumption again with something really nourishing and soothing like broth. So that is another thing that they make. And then for their break the fast meal, there's a dish in the book called chili con pignoli y passarin, which is basically whole roasted fish with raisins and pine nuts. And the raisins and pine nuts is something that comes from the Sephardi side of cuisine. But the word passarin, I'm saying it without the right accent, but it literally, it's an old word for grape. I think the current word for grape is uva, but passarin literally means fainted grape, which is just the best word for a raisin ever, a fainted grape. So they traditionally make it with red mullet, but you can make it with any whole fish that you prefer, like snapper or branzino. And it's just really like light and delicate and has, kind of a sweet tart sauce that's really delicious. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, which is one of my favorite dishes of Roman Jewish cuisine at all, is it's like an almond cake with a little bit of lemon essence called bocca di dama, or woman's mouth is the kind of evocative name for that dish. And this is something you actually find both in Libyan cuisine and in Roman cuisine. Which I love because it's something that the both communities, they do it differently. The one from Libya has like a meringue topping, and the one in Rome tends to be a more simple topping of like powdered sugar and almonds. But this is a dish that's served on Pesach and also to break the fast on Yom Kippur. So it has kind of both things going on. And that cake, I have to show it to you. It's here. Oh, I opened up right to it. So this is a dessert spread from the book. And if you zero in right here, you see the boca di dama, and it's so light and fluffy, but also has that richness from the almonds. And you can make the caramelized fruit to go with it, and it's so delicious. What a way to break the fast.
I love the broth thing. I had no idea.
Yeah,
I have to let my dog into my bedroom, but there was an interesting question I'm going to throw out for you in the
sure.
chat. So you said to go back, you went to a bakery, wanted to pick up challah. There was no challah. So what are the traditional breads that people make motzi on for Shabbat or for a holiday?
Yeah, so I spoke with a woman named Roberta Nahum, who is a Roman Jew who, she's probably in her, I would say, 70s, and she grew up in Rome. And she told me that when she was growing up, nobody had challah, and they just made motzi on like regular Italian bread, or, like any kind of Italian bread that you would normally eat during the week. And she also said that in more recent years, probably in the last 10 to 20 years, there are some families who have started making challah because they've traveled to the States, or they've traveled to other parts of Europe or to Israel and have tasted challah. And, how could you say no? So you will sometimes see it in people's homes, but you won't find it in bakeries.
Vered Gottman, Vered, who told you could come tonight, has a follow-up question.
I'm so glad Vered's here. Hi, Vered.
Do the Libyan Jews in Rome eat the bollo buns or cookies to break the fast?
I did not come across either of those in specific, but that doesn't mean they don't. So I actually had a question when I was first starting this book about whether or not to include Libyan recipes, because the community is such a new part. It's only been around, 60-ish years. And the cuisine itself dates back, 2,000 years. And it came to my senses eventually and said, of course I'm going to include it. They're part of the community. But I would say that my research was fairly exhaustive for the Roman Jewish side, and for the Libyan Jewish side, it was a little bit more, not dismissive, but I didn't necessarily, it wasn't a book about Libyan Jewish cuisine. So it's possible that they do that, but I didn't find that. Oh, but they do serve Safra, the semolina cake, it's a semolina cake that is found in lots of different parts of the Middle East and North Africa. And it's drenched in a sugar syrup. And that is something that they do serve for breaking the fast. It's very delicious.
That sounds really delicious.
Yeah. Oh, hi, puppy.
He's so annoying.
Wait, I gotta show you. I'm doing show and tell. This is the Safra. And it comes topped with sesame seeds and almonds, and it's so soft. I mean, you can cut it in pieces, but you really like spoon it out. It's almost like a pudding cake hybrid. So good.
Somebody wants to know, is that what some people call Safta cake? It's different, right?
It's not Safta cake. I think of Safta cake as being a little bit more like a pound cake ish, and this is not that. This is just semolina flour. I have a little bit of a cold, so it probably sounds funny. It's Safra, like Safra, not Safta, but similar sounding.
Gotcha. Okay. So hold on, I'm just going to share a couple of people have asked, is this being archived? Is this being recorded? Yes, it will get shared. You can watch it again, which is lovely. Thank you so much for asking. But so yes, it's being recorded. It feels like there was so much research that went into this book, and there's also such a personal element. How did researching and writing this book, did it impact the way that you're sort of cooking or, approaching food at all? Did that change for you?
In a way, I should say, I pitched this book to my agent very early in the pandemic when, I think everybody in the food world was like, what do we do? And I had already been thinking about what book I wanted to write next. And so, was grateful that it got accepted and I had a chance to write it, and then was like, I can't go to Italy. There's a travel ban. I literally can't fly there. I mean, I had been many times before and had my memories, and but the early part of my research was all done with cookbooks. I tracked down a lot of family cookbooks and old Italian Jewish books. Although interestingly, Italian Jewish food is very different and like Sicilian Jewish food and the north of Italy, like it's very different because they were not a connected country at that point. But I also did a lot of Zoom cooking with people where I would Zoom into people's kitchens in Italy and be like, hey, show me how you make that cake or how you make that, artichoke dish or zucchini dish or whatever. And then finally, like 3 months before my manuscript was due, the travel ban was lifted and I was able to go, and thank God. So that's not really what you asked, but I just wanted, it was a very different process for research than my other books, which were so much, like my last book, the Jewish Cookbook, I cooked with so many people in their homes. And, this was limited in that way because of the pandemic. But I think what I noticed when I was working on the book is that I am an American. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I just mean that, I wanted to share the stories and the recipes of Roman Jews, and I wanted them, the recipes to be authentic, as much as I hate that word, as possible. But I also wanted to come to the process with the understanding that I'm Jewish and I understand the Jewish side of things, but the Roman side, I take a different approach. And one funny story that I share in the book and have talked about, if my mom is on the Zoom tonight, which I think she is, I'm sorry you're hearing this again, but I was at my friend Michaela's house, the tour guide that I mentioned earlier. And it was Sukkot when I went, and we were she asked me to make sandwiches, basically, to bring to the sukkah. And so she had focaccia, actually pizza bianca, which is like similar to focaccia bread. And she had concha, which is a fried and marinated zucchini dish that's in the book. So delicious. She had sliced tomatoes, and she had mozzarella. And so I was like putting all the things on every sandwich and like layering them up, thinking I'm making like a caprese style sandwich. And she looked over from whatever she was doing, and like her eyes went wide and she got super horrified. And she's like, oh, you don't put everything on one sandwich. It's either zucchini and mozzarella or tomato and mozzarella. It's not all on one. And I remember thinking, like, why? I actually said to her, I was like, why not? It tastes so good together. And so we basically had a laugh. And of course, I made the remaining sandwiches to her specifications, but it made me realize that, like, I'm coming from this American more is more when it comes to flavor approach, and they are much more restrained and traditional. And so, that tension was there while I was developing the recipes for sure. But wherever I made like an Americanization, which would literally be something like I added orange zest to this cookie when there wasn't before, it was nothing, I'm not adding like matcha or like something outlandish to that cuisine. I make a note about it so people know that I made a little tweak to satisfy our American tastes.
I just loved reading that story, and it was so visual and imagining you making the sandwiches, and like, of course, why wouldn't I put all the stuff on the sandwich?
I know. I literally felt like I had been caught like doing something really bad. I was like, I'm so sorry. What did I do?
When you think about it, really, when you think about Europe, you may not interrupt right now. You think hi, everybody. When you think about like European sandwiches, right? Like they're much more simple than when you go to like an American deli or something like that. You mentioned before that Jews were not allowed to buy large fish, but they were allowed to sell fried things. And I was curious about the connection to Frito misto. I know that that's sort of like very famous, but that's also typically seafood. Is there any connection between Frito misto and Jews? And
Yeah, so Frito misto, for folks who aren't familiar, is basically like Italian tempura, right? You take vegetables or seafood. If you're not kosher, you would use, non-kosher types of seafood, sometimes like mozzarella balls or various odds and ends, and you fry them, you batter them. And Roman Jews use a fairly thick batter, and then you fry them, and they're so delicious. And you serve them, fresh with lemon juice, like lemon squeezed on. And there are many people who say that that dish actually originated in the Roman Jewish ghetto, partially because Jews were allowed to be fricatory, to sell fried foods. And so they say that the dish kind of evolved there. Roman Jews call it pezzetti fritti, which literally means like fried little pieces, which I think is another like lovely and evocative name for the dish. And so, yeah, I mean, it definitely is very central to Roman Jewish cuisine and potentially even stems from there.
That's so interesting to hear. I also saw Susan Barocas was with us, which is so
Oh, hi,
lovely.
Susan. Yeah.
And she had a question. She says, I love the book. Join the
Thank
club.
you.
Roman Jewish cuisine is such a wonderful blend of many different food influences. So much Sephardic influence got incorporated. Do the Italian Jews make spoon sweets or preserves for the high holidays or to serve to guests year round?
So the most kind of the jam that is used the most is a sour cherry jam, which you wouldn't really see on the high holidays. But that, you know, Roman Jews love sour cherry jam, and they put it in their crostata, their pies, and their tarts, including a really famous one with sweetened ricotta and a layer of sour cherry at the bottom. The Libyan Jews serve like an apple marmalata, like an apple preserve. They do serve that for Rosh Hashanah, where it's not really like apple butter or applesauce or apple jam. It's pieces that are in this kind of like sticky, jammy, you know, preserved liquid, and it's so tasty. It's something that if I make, I would serve it with like a cheese plate or, but they serve it like little spoonfuls. So that's one example I can think of.
Someone else asked a great question, which was one of my questions to ask, but maybe you could talk a little bit about the name Portico, and what it comes from and what it symbolizes and why you wanted it for the title of the book.
Totally. I'm glad I have the book here. So this is the top of Portico de Ottavia, which translates to Octavia's porch. It was built by Augustus, I think, for his sister Ottavia. Here's a better picture of it. Oh man, this was just a perfect September day. Sorry for the glare. So this is an ancient ruin that dates back to Roman times and has basically stood in the same place for 2,000 years and was many, many different things over the history of Rome. But kind of most significantly for many hundreds of years was a fish market. And it's the fish market where the Roman Jews got, you know, their tiny fish because they weren't allowed to buy the big ones, but it's where they did their fish shopping. And it very much kind of, to me, stands as like the entrance to the Roman ghetto, because it's basically the Portico de Ottavia and then like Portico de Ottavia Street, like running out of it. And that's where all the restaurants are and where the Jewish school is. And right off of it is where the big synagogue is. So I loved that it kind of stood as like a physical manifestation of the entrance to the ghetto. And then also the name Portico, the word portico means like entrance or front porch, or like, you know, entryway. And so I just loved the symbolism of Portico as being like an entry into a cuisine that I think a lot of people aren't as familiar with. And yeah, so it had kind of a double meaning. And I have to give props to my editor, because at first they wanted me to call it the Roman Jewish Cookbook, which, you know, I understand from a marketing perspective, because, you know, that says what the book is, and Portico is a little more poetic, but I'm really glad that they let me go with it, because I think it really captures the spirit of the book.
I love that. I love that. I love the entryway, right? Like we always talk about, you know, entrances into Jewish life, but I really love that. And also, yes, naming cookbooks is really fun. So
yes.
I'm happy they let you have the name.
My last book, the title of my last book was The Jewish Cookbook, which was so boring. And, you know, I understand why it was called that, because it was meant to be like a book of all Jewish food. But I was like, I'm going poetic for this one. I'm going to fight for that.
I love this question Paige just shared. If you visit Rome, what's the one Jewish food you would recommend you have to try?
There's not one, but If you've never had them before, I think you have to go with the carciofi alla giudia, which are the Jewish style fried artichokes. You basically take a whole artichoke and you pare away the rough bits and kind of trim them down. And I have a whole step-by-step of how to trim an artichoke the Italian way, because I don't think it's something that Americans really, by and large, know. So hold on, I'm looking for a picture of it. But basically you take the artichoke and then you fry it 2 times. You fry it once. Oh, I love this picture. Sorry, show and tell. This is Michaela, the tour guide I was telling you about. And this is one of the elders in the community. And they're literally like laughing over this artichoke. That was right when the fight broke out between that man and another woman about how to cook them. Okay, here is a fried artichoke in one of the restaurants. So you see, like, you fry it once to cook the heart, and it becomes kind of like soft and velvety and tender. And then you take it out of the oil and you pry it open once it's cooled a little bit. And then you fry it again to crisp up the leaves. So you have this like creamy centered, oily but not heavy, crisp, kind of like potato chip leaves with salt and a little lemon. And I have a recipe for them in the book because I wanted to have them in the book, but I almost think you should skip that recipe and make the simpler things and go to Rome and have them there. Like if you want a project for Rosh Hashanah, do it. But yeah, I would definitely say that's the number one thing. And the second thing would be the pizza ebraica, the bar cookie that is sold at this one pastry shop called Boccioni that I love.
We do have, someone pointed out, we do have a couple of articles on the Nosher about where to eat Roman Jewish food in Rome, and also some other Italian and Jewish cookbooks that came out last year, not specifically about Rome, but about Italian Jewish cuisine. So of course, please check those out as well. Leah, I have one last very important question for you, and we'll open it up to more questions from everybody here, which is, what will you be serving for breakfast after Yom Kippur?
Oh man. Part of me really wants to go the brodo route, but because my family has a kosher household, we're not going to probably do meat. And then, because I can't not have the dairy fest. So I'm going to show you what I'm going to make. It is called gnocchi alla romana, or like Roman style gnocchi, but it is not actually what we think of as like little potato pockets. It's a semolina dish. It's basically a gratin. It's on page 165. And you basically make semolina the same way you would make polenta and let it cool. And then you stamp out circles of it and layer them into a dish put cheese and butter on top and bake it. And it's so good. It's kind of like Roman Jewish mac and cheese in terms of a flavor profile. There's a little nutmeg in there. It's so good, and it's not hard to make. And it's the kind of thing, I taught it at a cooking demo 2 weeks ago or a week ago, and people were just sort of like, what is this magic? So that's what I'm going to serve.
Awesome. That looks amazing. Also, I'll do some show and tell too. Just, this book is not just with beautiful recipes, which it is, but it's also just beautiful. Like if you love travel, like you immediately feel sort of like immersed and like you're transported into another place because the photography is so beautiful. Sorry if you hear another dog. I definitely missed a bunch of questions. So if I didn't catch your question and you want to share it now, we have a little bit more time, and happy to have Leah answer some more questions about the recipes, about her process, whatever you're interested in. I think people want the tour guide that you recommended.
Oh yeah, here, I will type her name into the chat. It's so funny. I don't know if I am just more aware of it or if people are actually going more, but it feels like everybody went to Rome or Italy this summer, or like going this fall, which honestly, fall is the time to go, because especially with climate change and hot summers in Europe, like it is too hot to go there in the summer. But what is it? Jewish Roma walking tours. I don't have the link, but if you search Jewish Roma walking tours, you'll find her, and she's just absolutely wonderful. She's so knowledgeable. I really like, when I wanted to do the book, I called her and I was basically like, can I do this book? Because I didn't want to, like, if she was planning to write one, I didn't want to write it. And she was like, I've been wanting to write a book for 20 years. It's not going to happen. I am a tour guide. I am not a cookbook author. She was like, you write it and like, I'll sell it in the bookshop. I was just like, done. So, I really, like, honestly, I cannot recommend her tours highly enough. So if you go there, definitely take one. Here she is. She's so fashionable. And here's her family, her 3 boys, one of her sons. They're a really sweet family.
Alana has a question. Do we see influences of Roman Judaism on Judaism? I'm going to say Roman Jewish culture in other parts of Italy or elsewhere in Europe. Sorry if I butchered your question, Alana.
No, it's okay. I mean, no, it's really, I would say it's really its own thing. There are definitely, like, some of the other books that have been mentioned that cover all of Italian Jewish cuisine. There are other parts of Italy that have important Jewish communities historically and currently, like, Milan has a big community now, and Venice has a historical ghetto neighborhood, and but no, Rome's really its own little thing, and they won't let you forget it. They're like, this is who we are, and I love how much pride they take in their community.
Raquel wants to know, figs. Do Roman Jews cook with figs?
Not really. I did not see figs or pomegranates, and I looked because I wanted those ingredients I think those were too fancy, so there's a lot of raisins, a lot of like citrus zest, which is, you see a lot in Mediterranean cuisine. There is one dish for fichi carmeletta, or like caramelized figs. So I actually stand corrected. There is one recipe in the book that had figs, but I didn't see a lot of like fresh figs. Sour cherry jam, that is their vibe. It comes up in a lot of different things.
Can you talk more? This is from Joy. Can you talk more about pizza Iberica and how is it different than biscotti and mandel bread?
That's a good question. So it's very similar in many ways, in that you make a dough, you form a log, and then you kind of cut the log to make individual pieces of cookie. Where it differs is that biscotti is twice baked, and mandel bread is twice baked, and so it gets really crisp and dry. And pizza Iberica, it has a crispy, kind of crunchy outside, but the inside is still very soft. It's almost like an almond cookie inside, so it's kind of the best of both worlds, right? And it's just absolutely jam packed with the filling. And when you go to the bakery, Boccioni, they their version is like an inch thick, right? I feel like bakeries always supersize. I'm thinking about like Hamantaschen in New York City that are like this big, and when people make them at home, they're not that big. So the one that the recipe that I put in the book is like a little smaller than the one at Boccioni, but I tried to stay true to the general vibe of them. They're so good.
A question from Beth. I love this question because I'm always curious to hear other people's processes as well. How many times do you prepare a recipe before including it in your books, and what is your process for recipe testing?
Yeah, it really depends. It depends on if I have made something really similar and I'm kind of just tweaking a flavor profile, right? Like if I'm making a new babka or something, I have my standard babka dough. I'm sure, Shannon, you know this well from the babka deliciousness in your books, but you don't necessarily have to change the dough that much. So you're just kind of figuring out like what fillings. So that maybe I only make it 2 times just to make sure that the ratios are correct. But there are some recipes like pizza Iberica where 15, 20 times. I have pizza Iberica recipes in other cookbooks of mine that are wrong, and like that I have evolved in my understanding of pizza Iberica, and I have done more research. And I think this book is the one that cracks the code finally. But yeah, I always say that developing a recipe is one part science and one part poetry, right? And I don't mean that in like a woo-woo way. I just mean like you're taking something very scientific, temperature and weight and measure and time and like all of these like scientific pieces. And then you're also trying to find the right language to take something quite technical and quite hands-on and to express it in a way that people reading a book will be able to understand. So yeah, I love recipe developing, except that it's very solitary. Like it's not something you usually do with other people. So
I know I do always miss that, having like a thought partner in that.
yeah.
Although we are always somehow mentally connected and at least on our seasonal Instagram sharing.
It's wild. It's wild, Shannon. I don't know if this might be too niche to share, but like Shannon and I and like the Nasher and I like have accidentally posted the same things, like almost the same exact recipe without knowing the other person was going to post it like a half a dozen times. It's it's
I
fun
always
at this
feel
point.
like, oh, we're just we're in sync and
Yeah,
we must be doing something right?
totally.
This is a great question from Edith. Can you recommend a restaurant whose menu comes close to Roman Jewish food that might be in the New York area?
There is a restaurant that's not a kosher restaurant in the theater district called Latanzi. It's been around for a long time, since the 80s, 70s, 80s, and it's a Roman restaurant. And so they do have fried artichokes, and they have that chicken dish that we mentioned, because the chef was originally from Rome and grew up eating these dishes and didn't even realize that they were Roman Jewish until later in life. So that's one place you can go. And there is a place in Midwood, in Brooklyn, that actually calls itself like a Jewish Roman kosher restaurant. I think it's still around. I don't know the name of it. I never went because, again, the research was like during the pandemic and I just wasn't going to restaurants at the time. And the restaurant also had like some like more basic kosher like steak and like, stuff on it that I was like, is this a serious restaurant? But I can look it up even and see what the name of it is. But I would try Latanzi if you eat at non-kosher restaurants.
From Alana, are there many vegetarian-friendly, non-dessert, like savory vegetarian recipes in the book?
Oh, so sorry. The name of the restaurant is Trastevere, which is actually the name of the neighborhood in Rome where the Jews used to live prior to living in the ghetto. So you can look up Trastevere on Coney Island Avenue. Oh, it closed. All right. Well, there you go. I didn't hear your last question. I don't remember.
I feel
Sorry.
like I can answer this, which is yes, or yes, there's a lot of vegetarian friendly recipes.
Oh, yeah. There's plenty of vegetable forward soups. One of my favorite soups is a turnip and rice soup, which again sounds like what? That sounds so boring and not interesting at all. But the turnips get so silky, and with all the olive oil and like the comforting rice, like this is the time to make it on like a rainy, chilly night. So yeah, there's a lot of vegetarian and even quite a bit of vegan stuff in there.
This is a question that a couple of people actually have asked, which is, what is your next project?
I am working on another cookbook, which I'm not going to share right at this minute, but will soon, I promise. But I just want to mention my newsletter, the Jewish cook. Sorry, no, not the Jewish Cookbook. It's getting late, Shannon. The Jewish Table, which is a newsletter that I write on Substack, and it is really just a chance for me to get personal and to share lots of recipes of things that wouldn't fit into my book or my articles otherwise. So if you want to like keep up to date with what I'm doing, you can follow me on Instagram, or the Jewish Table is like an ongoing project.
We've gotten so many comments about how interesting this was and how much people learn, myself included. So I want to thank you so much, Leah, for being with us. Probably have time for one more question if you want to share one in the chat, but I will share the link again. Again, we're talking tonight with Leah Koenig from all about her book, Portico and Roman Jewish Recipes, Traditions, History. So please check it out. And want to wish everybody an easy fast. Gemar Chatima Tova again. Yes, this was recorded and it will be shared in a follow-up email. So if you're here, you got the email, you'll get another one, and it will have a link to this and to the recipe that we've shared on the nosher from the book, and as well as a link to the book if you want to support Leah in this beautiful work. So any last words, Leah?
This was great. Thank you so much for always being a wonderful support and for creating a platform for global Jewish food. You guys do it best.
Thank you so much. Thanks again, everybody. Good night.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks. Shana Tova. Bye.